Hey students, welcome back to class, if you will. Over the course of however many weeks, I'm going to be doing some screencasted lectures for you. These are going to come in at about 15 minutes each, so they're pretty crash coursey for a lecture. All materials, resources, that sort of stuff will be posted in Google Classroom so that you have access to the information. But I figured this was a good way to improve on our distance learning. So without further ado, here's our first in a series of screencasted lectures. This one's going to be on the Russian Revolution. When last we met, we were talking about the outcomes of the First World War, and one of the things we noticed was that the Russians got out early, and one of the main reasons why was this revolution. So we're going to hop back in history a little bit to about the turn of the century, predating the First World War, and we're just going to kind of run through some of the major events that led to the Russian Revolution and how this leads to eventually both the Second World War, but also the Cold War, and pushes humanity forward in a lot of ways. So it's a very much an unintended outcome of the First World War, though if you remember back to one of the in-class story times, maybe not so unpredicted when we think about the writings of both Marx, but specifically Engels and what he wrote in the 1880s about revolution and what war could mean for the cause, as it were. So here we go, hopping into the Russian Revolution. So one of the main things that we're going to want to take note of is the fact that in Russia, the peasantry, that lower class of social hierarchy, really had been left behind. So as we've seen a really steady encroachment of modernity over the course of the last 200 and 250 years or so, going back to the Enlightenment, in a place like Russia, Russia did not experience that same enlightened growth. One of the reasons why Ms. Duma on one of our previous podcasts said that the Russians were not a world-class power. And really, when you look at events in England, the United States, France, Germany, China, Japan, just to name a couple of the major or growing powers during this time, Russia experiences very little of this. So from the peasants class, the peasantry had been held under the boot of the boyars, the nobility, for roughly 400 years, and it wasn't until 1867 that the serfs of Russia were freed from their bondage and allowed to exist outside of the noble realm underneath this nobility. To put that in stark contrast, most of feudal Europe was gone by the 1300s and certainly by the 1400s during the Age of Exploration. The serf class or serfdom as a system of organization had ceased to exist. The only other country in the world that still had a serf noble relationship around the time of Russia was Japan. But even Japan, through the Meiji Restoration and the Boshin War, had gotten rid of that system as well. So Russia definitely had this really backwards system in place. And as a result of this, the peasant class is really, as you're starting to see come up here on the screen, really at a disadvantage. They're still going to be working in a cottage industry. They're still going to be working long hours, and a lot of their labor is still going to go up. It's not going to stay within their social class, and there's not going to be any sort of what will later be termed by conservative economists, any sort of trickle-down effect in the economic system. The serfs are going to basically be at the bottom, and being at the bottom, as that last bullet point comes out there, means nothing really good. So from about 1870 to 1900, the peasants are really disadvantaged, and most people in Russia are peasants. Now, flipping over to the other side, you've also got this like burgeoning sort of economic middle class that's starting to participate in the small, and I cannot emphasize that enough, small amount of industrialization that was taking place from about 1870 to 1910 or so during what we would term the second industrial revolution. These workers are also very upset as well. So you've got the peasants on the one side, and then you've got these pre-industrial and early industrial workers in Russia who are also very upset. One of the things that we're going to see all throughout the course of this mini lecture is going to be that Russia really fails to go all in on the economic, social, and political reforms that we saw take place whole scale across Europe and in Japan. And one of the things that we brought up about the failures of China and China's inability to reform and take on the Western powers, especially after the Opium Wars, is that they didn't go all in on those reforms. And Russia is very, very similar. So what we start to see here in the working class in urban Russia is this very socially immobile group of people who are uneducated, underpaid, overworked as well. And so all of this is just going to lead into one place. Like if you think of the like rivers, mountain streams feeding a river, we have this confluence of all of these different angry people, and all these angry people are going to come together and they're going to start to agitate for more social change. And all of this is going to be taking place way before the First World War. And so one of the misnomers is the First World War was the cause of the Russian Revolution. In a lot of ways, the Russian Revolution is the effect of many different tensions that had been rubbing against each other. This friction had been created, and this tension finally snaps because of the First World War, but because of just ineptitude as well. So when we think about this Czarist system that really, really, really becomes a focal point of tensions, as we said in class, these guys were absolute rulers. These were people who had not really experienced any of the political reforms that had taken place inside of Europe due to the Enlightenment, right? So you get the Tsar or Caesar, who's going to have absolute autocratic control. In fact, the last autocratic Caesar of Russia, in his titles, he has this long list, protector of the realm, yada, yada, yada. One of his titles is absolute autocrat, right? And there's nothing in there to check the power. There's no social contract theory. There's no belief that the Tsar is accountable to anybody inside of society. Right? So Tsar Nicholas II is the last Tsar of Russia. He's a guy who, as you can see, does not want the job. If you think of this roll of the dice leadership mentality that comes along with having a monarch, this would be a bad roll of the dice, right? Coming up snake eyes. He was not very good at what he did. He was a nice man, but a nice man does not a good leader make. And so Tsar Nicholas II is going to be wholly unprepared to deal with the challenges of this time period. And this is all easily seen when the Russians are totally whooped by the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. Hop into our Marching Towards Doomsday podcast for more information on this one. Now, all of this tension comes to a head when there's a series of protests that take place in January 1905, a day that's termed Bloody Sunday, right? So essentially what occurs here, and for brevity's sake, and because you can read about this in the other resources, a very peaceful protest turns very, very violent because there's no system of accountability in place. And one of the things that comes out of the Bloody Sunday events is that many of the people start to see this great divide that exists between them and their government as not just being an economic or social divide, but it's also this moral political divide. And so what many people believe needs to occur as a result of Bloody Sunday is that there needs to be a greater system of accountability that's going to be put into place, right? So essentially, these workers, they will not disband. There's agitators, people like Joseph Stalin, who will come back in full force in this later on. He is going to be, a huge leader in the second phase of revolution that's going to take place in 1917. These guys are all out there, they're protesting, and eventually the Cossacks, the people who are the traditional Mongolian descendant authoritarian arm of the Tsar, enable the Tsar to hold power. These guys are going to turn on the protesters, and as a result of this, there's going to be a massacre in the streets, right? And so you have all these peaceful protesters, all these people who just want to have more food, they want to have more money, and think about the labor strikes that we talked about in the labor movement that came out of the Industrial Revolution. All of these people are stamped out, right? And if you're a guy like Engels or Marx, who were dead by this time period, or one of their descendants like a Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, V.I. Lenin, or a Trotsky, you're going to look at this and say, see, this is exactly what we've been warning about. These are the people who are in control firing on their own people, holding them down. We need more revolution. Well, there is some revolution and accountability that comes out of this because there needed to be some sort of change. So some of the Tsar's power is going to be signed over to this group called the Duma. The Duma is like a Congress. Now, they don't have a lot of power. If you imagine like a pie chart with 100% of the power that had been in the hands of the Tsar, now like 99% of that power is going to be in the hands of the Tsar. And this Duma, this representative body, they're going to have a small amount of power. Not a ton, but a small amount. And if you're a peasant, if you're one of those angry workers, this is at least something, right? So people aren't happy, but they're no longer angry. And so this seems to stop any sort of huge amount of tension. But there's no reform, right? Either you're all in or you're not in at all. You've got to make whole-scale changes, and that does not happen. Right? So this leads to an ineffective body. And from 1906 to 1917, the Duma is going to be around, but it's not going to do anything. Why? Well, because the Tsar has absolute authority over the Duma. He's got like veto powers. So if the Duma does something that he doesn't like, he can just nix it. He doesn't have to do anything, right? And so the Duma is largely ceremonial. Right? Now, this system probably would have remained in place had it not been for World War I. And as we've seen, World War I was a highly disruptive event. I can take all of the information here on the screen and just summarize it by saying that the Russians will average 230,000 casualties a month for the duration of the war. This is unsustainable. There's no way that the Russians are going to be able to withstand this kind of pressure that's being placed on society by the war. And then remember, Russia's not fully industrialized. Russia doesn't have the capacity to feed its people. The war is going to stretch Britain, France, and Germany to the brink, and these were all first-class powers. Russia is a second-class power, right? They're not going to be able to hang in there for the duration of the war. And by 1916, the Brusilov offensives that were meant to break the stalemate in the East fail, and the Russians are basically, for all intents and purposes, out of the war. The Tsar is going to do the best that he can to try and save the war effort. He'll go out into the field in 1917. He's a wholly ineffective leader, and while he's out in the field, there's a whole series of protests that take place, these peaceful peace and bread marches that are mainly going to be led by women. This looks like it's going to be a repeat of the 1905 Bloody Sunday Massacre. But this time, the Cossacks enable the strikers. This time, the mechanism that's meant to hold the people down turns on the government. Why? Well, when the Cossacks give up, then we call them the soldiers. And the soldiers in the February Revolution, right, which actually takes place in March, whole crazy thing here, these guys are going to side with the protesters. Why? Because they've been the ones who've been thrown out into that meat grinder of World War I. And so the Tsar abdicates. He gives up, didn't want to be a Tsar anyway, turns this power over to this guy, Kerensky. Now, Kerensky is basically trying the best he can to set up a provisional government. But the problem is that he doesn't have enough authority. Remember, the Duma was vastly ceremonial and unable to do much of anything. And so these small groups, these Soviets, start to form up, and these are workers' councils, they're soldier councils, they're just groups of people. And one group of people in particular takes over the Soviets. These people, the Bolsheviks, right? And so this is going to kind of put a pin in video number 1 for us, mini lecture number 1 for us, because at this October time period here in the revolution, we have the Soviets, we've got the Kerensky provisional government, you've got this war effort that's at this point in time still trying to be sustained, but soldiers are turning back, they're refusing to get on the trains, and basically the Russian Revolution is on the way, right? We've got all that tension, all that pressure. Something has to break. And so we've got Kerensky, we've got Lenin, we've got these two like bipolar forces inside of society, and one of them is going to take power, right? Now, I haven't talked about Lenin. I haven't talked about any of the Bolsheviks. I haven't talked about any of that sort of stuff. So make sure you tune in for video number 2 on the Russian Revolution mini lecture series. In this lesson, we just wanted to figure out where all the tension came from, what the powers were. So make sure you go back, make sure you know about 1905, Bloody Sunday, make sure you know about the Duma and the failed reforms, and make sure you know about the February Revolution that leads the way towards the abdication of the Tsar. Thanks, guys, for tuning in on this one. First of many distance learning events. Glad to have you with us. Have a